put this together. The name of their band, by the way, is Catlats. It's really original. It's Carson and the Ladies and the Scrubs. We couldn't think of anything better than that. So this is a very bittersweet and emotional worship service for me and for all the others who have poured our hearts out into these students over here. I know I speak for Cindy Morrison and the student leaders to watch them grow from wee little babies to young adults is really, it's just something that it's hard to put into words. So our class is small this year, but a stellar one. I wanted to mention something about each of them. Taylor Han, also known as Tay Tay. I remember her, or Tay Tay Cray Cray, actually. First memory I have of her in student ministry when she was a wee little sixth grader going off to beach camp, coming into the seventh grade, and just a tiny little thing and timid. And she had nightmares, and she had to crawl into bed with my daughter Adri, who was an intern at that time. But look at her now, fearless and a humble young lady with a beautiful spirit. So cool to watch you grow up. Jacob Farr, my first memory of you was at Winterfest at Liberty University over the winter break. It's 19 degrees out. So what do you think Jacob was wearing as we traipsed across the campus? Shorts and flip-flops. But thank you for your faithful participation in our Embrace student ministry. Such a pleasant spirit, always smiling and a joy to be around. Jonathan Bennett, Mr. Clemson. For you that don't know this already, I'm not the biggest Clemson fan. So on student ministry nights on Wednesday night, if a student happens to arrive wearing some Clemson gear, it's 10 push-ups per Clemson Tiger Paw. And I think Jonathan is probably the strongest student in our ministry and probably holds the record. Maybe Danny, you might be in there close for most push-ups in the history of our student ministry. But Jonathan is a faithful Bible student, full of inquisitive questions, a joy to have sitting at my feet as we teach the scriptures. Then there's James Ingram, our jokester with a big personality. Brings energy to every endeavor, a mission trip beast who is at the center of our name change to Embrace. And I have just loved doing life with you, young man. It's good to see you grow up and actually grow up. And then Rachel Paquin, lover of animals, and the reason that on any given afternoon the Walker compound looks like doggy daycare is she brings her dogs over to play with our dogs. And Nathan Paquin, lover of vintage European cars, the current caretaker of Greta, my old 1995 BMW with 340,000 miles. Take care of her, please. And Rachel and Nathan, as I think Noel mentioned, they have chosen to start their careers right here in Hickory. Rachel will be working as a vet tech, and Nathan is currently working as a nurse assistant and is going back to school to get his nursing degree. So congrats to each of you for reaching this milestone we call graduation, commencement, the emphasis on a new beginning rather than dwelling on past accomplishments like high school or college. But it's also an inflection point as well. It's a time for evaluation and decision making. What has worked for you up to this point? What needs to change? And interestingly enough, this year, it is a coincidence that the class of 2021 is not alone in graduating or commencing to a new reality this spring. In fact, our whole country, if not the whole world, is experiencing graduation, commencement as we recover from the pandemic, which in essence has been declared finished by the CDC. Whether that's true or not, we all know is probably debatable, but we are still at an inflection point as a country, as a world. So my message today is for all graduates, high school graduates, college graduates, and or pandemic-related graduates. All of us are at that inflection point. All of us should be evaluating and reflecting on the last 18 months and asking ourselves questions: what worked, what didn't work, what do I need to keep in my life, what do I need to change? And inflection points are nothing new for individuals, societies, faith communities, institutions. They are a reality of the human condition since the beginning of time. And that brings us to our text this morning, Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 19. And it's a passage delivered by Moses at a critical inflection point in Israel's history. Now, many of you are familiar with the book of Deuteronomy, often quoted by Jesus himself. It is the last book of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, as some often refer to it. And Deuteronomy contains 34 chapters, so chapter 30 is close to the end of it. In Hebrew, by the way, Deuteronomy is not called Deuteronomy, it's called Devarim, or words, as in words of Moses. We have taken over the Septuagint name for it in English, Deuteronomy. It's a Greek word which literally means second law, but I think maybe a better in-context translation / interpretation would be copy or repetition. Coming as the last book of Torah, it is best described as God's repeating the words he gave to Moses to his people. It is a retelling of the story, a retelling of the commandments, and that relationship between God and his people and with Moses. It can almost be viewed as a compendium of Moses' sermons, if you want. And it's a collection together to reiterate and punctuate all that has transpired in this crazy relationship between God and his people that has had so many ups and downs at this point in history. Now, you may recall that history of God's people to this point, and I'd like to review that briefly. God's people find themselves in bondage in Egypt for centuries. They cry out. Interestingly enough, they've lost their identity. They simply cry out. To who? I don't know. The text says they cry out. God hears them and remembers his covenant with them, that covenant promising land, family, and a blessing. He calls Moses to be his hands and feet in bringing about the utter defeat of Egypt and the Egyptian gods through 10 plagues. Now, Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, he finally relents and releases God's people. But he changes his mind and pursues them to the shores of the Red Sea. With their back to the sea, God's people call out again, this time specifically to the Lord. They've regained their identity. And God's Spirit, in the form of an east wind, parts the sea, and God's people walk through the Red Sea, and they emerge on the other side free and a new nation. But that freedom takes them out of the most fertile region in the world, the Nile River Valley. And it deposits them in the desert. Now, rather than allowing his people to take the expressway, the highway, the Via Maris it's called, which is only a 3-week journey by foot to the Promised Land and goes along the Mediterranean Sea, God drives them into the desert for 40 years. That symbolic number 40 indicating a period of training, education, hardship, community building, and then finally, standing on the hills of Mount Nebo overlooking the banks of the Jordan River and on into the Promised Land, Moses gives his final exhortation, his version of a graduation / commencement speech. So I'd like you to stand with me as we read today's text, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 19. These are the words of Moses. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It's not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed, You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life. The word of the Lord. As we reflect and contemplate on this text, we note a few things. First, this is a simple and straightforward text. You don't need to have a seminary degree to understand it. It is not rocket science. Choosing life, choosing God, choosing obedience is right in front of us each day and easy to grasp and understand. We all have the ability to do that. Second, choosing life, while easy to grasp and to understand, is not easy to do. It doesn't lead to an easy life. When God's people were looking beyond the Jordan River from the desert hills, what did they see? In your mind's eye, what do you imagine they were looking at? What they saw is what you're seeing on the screen behind me. That's a picture taken from Mount Nebo, looking over the Jordan River into Israel. I don't know what you see in your mind's eye when you imagine the promised land. Maybe it's lush fields with crops, fruit trees, the land of milk and honey, a tropical paradise. But the reality of what they saw was more desert. What behind them was desert, what in front of them is desert. And while the desert is a beautiful land there in the southern part of Israel, it's still a desert wilderness. And in the north, in that period of history, a pretty swampy area as well. So after 40 years of training, they were entering a land that was still arid, with barely enough water for them to survive, and the land still needed to be conquered. They needed 40 years of desert training because the new life they were about to lead was not going to be easy. It's the same for us. You've heard me say, students, many times, if this gig called Christianity, if you choose it, is not for the faint of heart. It is why we changed our name of our student ministry to Embrace, and we adopted 2 Corinthians 12:10 as our tagline verse, and I'd like to read that to you. This is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The third thing I want to point out about this verse is that choosing life, choosing God, has a strong emphasis on obedience. Now, I think obedience in the Christian community at large has become a dirty word. As long as we check off the box for belief in God and Jesus as the Messiah, we can go about our day and our life without any consequences. Moses reminds us in this passage that we ought pay attention to the commandments of God. So, high school graduates, what does choosing life, choosing obedience look like for you going forward? You know the answer. You can give me the eye roll now because we've gone over it so many times. There's 3 things I want you to focus on. First, find 3 Christian student groups when you go off to college. Actually, I want you to do that this summer, that you can imagine yourself being part of and commit to choosing one. You need the support of other young Christians who are experiencing life as you are. You need to build that community. You need that support to survive. Second, you need to find 3 off-campus churches that you can imagine yourself attending and commit to going to one of them regularly. You need relationships outside your peer group who can provide you with wisdom and counsel and, on occasion, a free meal. Now, the good news is the 3 of you or 4 of you are going off to college, and we have sent students to each of those campuses. In fact, 2 of them are sitting right beside you, and 2 of them, I know for a fact, have done what I have asked them to do. So you have a good resource before you leave today to start on that homework assignment. The third thing is, this summer, before you leave for school, I want you to imagine what the first 2 weeks of school will be like. It'll be your first time without any parental supervision. There'll be a bunch of upperclassmen on campus partying away because they have quickly realized that no one does any work in the first 2 weeks of a semester, so why not get to campus early and enjoy campus life the way students would do it? And by the way, can I get an amen from everybody in this class? It hasn't changed in 100 years, has it? So, this summer, before you get to campus, I want you to think about what it's going to be like when you encounter that situation, and I want you to decide now how you're going to react to that environment. The worst thing you can do is to be surprised at the environment that you're getting ready to go into and to react without a plan. Okay, so what about the rest of us, recent college grads, and all of us coming out of the pandemic? How can we choose life, choose obedience? And I thought of 4 things that we could do. The first is to honor yourself. How are you taking care of your body, mind, and spirit? Over these past 18 months, what do you need to do differently now to ensure that you're being the best version of yourself that you can be? Have you allowed yourself to see yourself as God sees you, made in His image? Second, honor others. How are you doing in your relationships? Are you leaning into your family, your friends, your church, your community? It's been hard to do that, right? Because we can't be together all in one place, or we haven't been able to. If you haven't been leaning in, how can you start to do so? Allow yourself to see the best in others, because they too are made in the image of God. Third thing, honor creation. Are you being mindful of your consumption? And are you being a good steward of what God has blessed you with? You know, the pandemic has changed consumerism, some for the good, some for the bad. I encourage you to think about and evaluate how you've been a steward of God's resources in your life. It's an inflection point. And the last one, honor God. Have you endeavored to journey closer to God and acknowledge His presence in your life, even during bad times? Or have you drifted away in your journey with God? Have you sought to be His hands and feet in this crazy world of chaos? Now is the time to draw near to the Holy One. So each of us, every single day, we can decide to do these things. Choosing life is a daily decision. Actually, it's a moment-to-moment decision. If you choose life enough moments in a row, and then enough days in a row, and so on and so forth, you wind up living a life in the image of God. You wind up being a living witness and testimony to all that is good about God. I want to end today by telling a story. Actually, 3 stories. Don't worry, they're short. It's the story of 3 high school scrubs trying to figure out life, and somewhere along the line in their sophomore or junior years, they decided to own the faith of their youth. Faith became more important in their lives. And they banded loosely together, not part of any student ministry group, not part of any particular church, just 3 scrubs amongst many, trying to figure it out. Now, Pete was the leader, since he was the son of a retired missionary, and he at least knew a little bit about the Bible. John was the thinker, the intellectual. He wanted to read and discuss books by C.S. Lewis and A.W. Tozer, 2 well-known Christian writers. And Bob was the popular athlete, not afraid to proclaim his faith that he now owned. So they all reached the inflection point of graduation. They all had decisions to make about their future and about their faith journey. John went off to college to study psychology and wound up being a psychologist. Pete went to a Christian college and then on to seminary, and then he followed his father's footsteps, and he became a missionary, in his case to West Africa. And Bob accepted a football scholarship to an ACC school, got his MBA, and wound up getting a really good management job right out of school in the retail industry. So where are these men today? Well, after losing contact with John for more than 35 years, we reconnected in the classic boomer way via Facebook. He had retired at age 55 from psychiatry. He is an accomplished photographer. He is an amateur astronomer. He spends a lot of time hiking and camping and taking lots of pictures of the stars. and delighting in all that a comfortable life would provide. But if you look at his Facebook presence, it reveals something very unsettling. Somewhere along the way, he renounced his faith. He is an avowed atheist. And his Facebook attacks on anything Christian are vicious. There's an anger and a hatred and a maliciousness and a negativity about everything that he writes. His life on the surface seems easy and nice, but it belies what I think is a desperate soul who has not chosen life. Pete, my missionary friend, he gave me my first real Bible, by the way, in high school, has battled anxiety and depression for years. His ministry in West Africa has been arduous. Can you imagine working in the mission field for more than a decade and not seeing any tangible results? But Pete chose life a long time ago. He has raised, along with his wife, 2 godly boys who are about to embark on their own careers and will be witnesses and a testimony to all that is good about God. And his faithfulness to his calling in West Africa is producing a Christian community there for the first time ever. Choosing life has paid off for God's kingdom in Pete's case. And what about Bob? Bob's nice job in retail quickly dissolved as a result of a company bankruptcy. His first marriage failed. His second marriage failed. He struggled with painkillers as a result of a back injury during his playing days. Every job that he got after that seemed to blow up in smoke. He married a 3rd time and had 2 boys. He was in his late 40s when those boys were born. Everything finally seemed to be going Bob's way until it wasn't. His 3rd wife walked out on the family, leaving him to raise these 2 grade schoolers by himself. He moved across the country seeking work and stability. Bob and I have stayed in contact all these years. He's one of my best friends. But we finally had a chance to connect last month when we took our trip out west for the first time in almost a decade. His boys are 9 and 12 now, and just delightful young people. The 3 of them have done live stream church faithfully for 15 months. The boys are getting a Christian foundation. For you see, despite all the gut punches that Bob has endured, he has chosen life and continued to do so. These 3 are but a sampling of the life journeys that we all experience. The experiences each of us encounter are endless. I could probably have picked 3 stories from this group. We all have these ups and downs, these inflection points. But the decision choice is always the same. So I will give you the words, the Devarim of Moses once again. I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Class of 2021, church coming out of the pandemic, choose life.